In 1968, an elementary school teacher by the name of Jane Elliott did something that still has meaning today, 50 years later. Now, most of you do not know the name Jane Elliott, but the story I'm going to tell you, many of you have heard in one way or another. So I want to take you back to the evening of April 4th, 1968. Now, you history buffs will know that that night, that day, really is a day that rests with infamy in the United States history. On April 4th, 1968, Jane Elliott was in her home in small Riceville, Iowa, watching the television, and while she was ironing a teepee, that would be a Native American teepee, for a class exercise that she was going to engage in the next day with her third grade graders. She taught third grade at Riceville, Iowa school. And she was watching the TV, and on the TV came a special news report, a special bulletin, that's what they used to call it, announcing that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. That's why April 4th is a day that is pretty dismal for our country. And then during that news bulletin, the press, the news report cut away to a white reporter who pointed his microphone to a black leader in some urban setting and asked, quote, "When our leader, John F. Kennedy, was killed, his widow held us together. Who's going to control your people?" Unquote. Yeah, somebody said that on national news. I think back in 1968, that probably question was not at all unusual. But that question shocked Elliot to realizing that many thought of a white America as being entirely different from black America. And because the class exercise the next day centered on the theme of the Sioux prayer, and I'm going to quote that prayer, quote, "O Great Spirit, keep me from ever judging a man until I have walked in his moccasins," unquote. Because that was the class exercise the next day for her third graders, she started to imagine how she could teach her third graders about discrimination. And so she imaginatively, I give her really great credit because it took a lot for her to do this. She came up with an exercise to teach all of her third graders who happened to be white from rural Iowa what it meant to be the victim of discrimination. So the next day, that would be April 5th of 1968, she goes into her class and she announces that she's going to teach them about what it means to be essentially other. I'm sure she did not use that phrase, but that is really what she taught them. So she divided the class. Now this is where you're going. Some of you will remember this. She divided the class into blue-eye students and into brown-eye students. She had made some brown fabric collars and had the blue-eyed students wrap those collars around the brown-eyed students. Then for the rest of the day, she gave blue-eyed students special treatment. She told the blue-eyed students that they were special, that there was something in their melatonin skin that made their eyes turn blue, and that it was, and that they were more special as a result. And for the rest of the day, her blue-eyed students got special things. They got second helpings of lunch. They got access to a new jungle gym at the school, which the brown-eyed students could not access. The blue-eyed students got 5 extra minutes at recess. The blue-eyed students got to sit at the front of the classroom. The brown-eyed students had to sit at the back. Think about that for symbolism. The blue-eyed students were encouraged to play only with other blue-eyed students. And the blue-eyed students and the brown-eyed students had to drink at separate water fountains. She chastised the brown-eyed students who made mistakes and made examples of them to the whole class. And as she did this, she watched as the blue-eyed students started to become bossy and arrogant, and that the brown-eyed students started to become subservient. Now, this was only a single-day exercise, but she, in that one day, realized that the schoolwork of the brown-eyed students was suffering. They did poor on tests taken during that day, and there were other, and on other indicators of success, they did poorly. The next day, okay, so this would be April 6th, the next day, 2 days after Dr. King was murdered, Elliot reversed the roles. She made the brown-eyed kids the ones who had privilege, and the blue-eyed ones were the ones who had to wear the collars. And the brown-eyed kids on the second day got all the privileges that the blue-eyed kids had had on the day before. But something interesting happened. She found that the brown-eyed kids, now the ones that were favored, weren't as demeaning as the blue-eyed kids had been the day before. And she theorized, and later confirmed by the kids themselves, that this was because the brown-eyed kids knew what it felt like to be discriminated against, to be othered by the blue-eyed kids. So brown-eyed kids had understood this on the first day. They had learned what it meant to be at the bottom of the heap. And the kids later, so a few days later, the kids wrote about what it felt like to be discriminated against. And the children's reactions, so their stories were published in the Riceville Recorder, your little town newspaper, under the headline of, quote, "How Discrimination Feels," unquote. From there, fate intervened, and the Associated Press picked up the story. And before Elliot Jane Elliott knew, she was on Johnny Carson's show. The producer for Johnny Carson's Tonight Show called and invited her to New York to be on the show. And then what happened after that, after she was on the show, wasn't at all positive. TV viewers called in and criticized Elliot for experimenting with white children. One caller even called in and said black kids are used to being discriminated against. How dare she subject white kids to that trauma? And then she paid a price for her experiment, frankly, for her idealism, back home in Riceville, because there was backlash in Riceville over her engaging in this exercise. She was shunned by her teachers. There was only, out of a number of teachers at the school, there was only one that continued to talk to her afterwards. She was shunned by people in the community. Her son was bullied as a result of Elliot's work and her publicity over it. Apparently, Riceville thought that Elliot was, in turn, implicitly calling Riceville racist, although Elliot did no such thing. But, people reacted that way, and that tells you the insecurities that people have around discussions about race, even though they weren't even participating in it. However, the idea of teaching about discrimination, about actually educating about discrimination, about what it means to walk in the shoes of someone else, that had huge appeal. And as this country was coming to grips, having tackled Jim Crow vigorously in the 1960s, and now then in the 70s and 80s, having to deal with the stuff that was at the workplace, the stuff that was in the churches, the stuff that were in their organizations, Jane Elliott became quite a sought-after speaker. And she eventually left teaching at Riceville and began conducting diversity training at major corporations and for state and local governments and federal government as well. In fact, Jane Elliott was the forerunner of the work that I do now, my human inclusivity work with my company, Human Inspiration Works. She is someone on whose shoulders I now stand. And as for those third grade students, and I should add that there was a movie actually made about this experiment where they went back to Riceville and talked to some of the students. And about 15 years after this, there was a reunion of the students from her third grade class. And one of those students wrote about how this experiment 2-day experiment had impacted them for the rest of their lives. And I'm going to read you a quote from one of those students. Quote, and this shows up on the site of the Lowell Milken Center that identifies Jane Elliott as a hero. Here's a quote from one of her students. Quote, "This brown eyes, blue eyes exercise is an emotional learning experience which gets seared into your soul and becomes part of who you are. You carry it with you wherever you go. Sometimes, whether you want to or not, and unlike things you learn in school like math or algebra, you cannot unlearn it. You cannot forget it." Unquote. You carry it with you wherever you go. That is how we get change in our country. That is how we make a difference in the world. By getting people to think and by getting ideas and lessons seared into one's soul. Jane Elliott, she was an idealist. She made an impact. She paid a price for it, but she never stopped. She's still alive, still speaking, still doing her work, and she is a hero of mine.